Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of The Modern Dentist, where today we have with us Isar, who is the founder of Uncover Consulting, which is a company dedicated to understanding organizational psychology and helping businesses, large and small, figure out how to implement tools to support them in the growth of their businesses. So, really excited to have you with us, Isar.
Yeah,
Can you tell us a little bit about you, your background, and,
Sure.
and how you came to found Uncover?
Yep. So I had a background in consulting where I started helping kind of companies of all different sizes typically approach strategic problems. But over that time, I kind of worked out the area I was most interested in and where I felt like I could have the most impact was people in organization work. So that's how teams operate, how they interact with each other, how specific decisions you make about the structures impact the behavior of people on teams. So after that, I actually went back to get trained as a psychologist, and now I run Uncover, like you said. The aim of Uncover really is to solve two problems. I think problem number one is if I was to ask you how your work is going, or if I was to give you a survey, odds are you'll probably lie to me. And there's a whole host of good reasons why you might do that. You might have an incentive to lie. You might be telling me the truth, but that truth is whatever's just salient in front of mind to you. And even if you are telling the truth, often it's quite shallow information. It doesn't tell you why people are behaving the way they behave. It doesn't tell you what are the drivers for some of the challenges people are facing. So the reason it's called Uncover is we use a bunch of psychology tools to kind of uncover what's going on. And we can talk about what those look like if you want. But that's one problem. And then the second problem is we want to test to see whether interventions we launch work. So we do measurement, we do longitudinal measurement with some of our clients. If they're big enough, we try and do randomized control trials to try and actually have a good understanding of whether an intervention has been effective or not. So we're trying to take a bit more of a kind of test and learn approach to people's stuff.
Okay, really, really interesting. So the reason we thought it would be so fascinating for you to come on and talk about how this applies to clinical work is because most of our listeners will work in a small business where they have the same pressures, challenges of any organization. And I think certainly what we hear is that it's taken perhaps less seriously, or it's thought about less than you might in a really big organization, even though it's just as important. So I think what we wanted to do today was to think about the psychological tools that can help a clinician perform at the top of their game within the environment that they work in, and what each stakeholder in that clinic, let's say, for example, can do to contribute to that. So, but before I do that, I actually want to hear a little bit about you personally, because you have some experience in consulting, and you then became a psychologist. But what were you doing before? Were you always interested in organizational design and the psychology of people and teams?
Yeah, so I guess if we go really far back, I originally was interested in economics, but the bit of economics I was most interested in was like the decision-making component. I think ultimately people are weird and the way they behave is weird, and understanding why they behave the way they behave is like always been quite interesting. I did my undergrad, for example, like the whole focus towards the end was on an area of economics which is called matching theory, which is like when normal economics breaks for a whole host of reasons. Typically you can't price goods, and you can't price goods because they are repugnant goods is the term they use in economics, which is where it's kind of unethical or impractical to price things. So Alvin Roth, who won the Nobel Prize and actually gave a lecture at my university, he talked about kidney exchanges and how you could create a clearinghouse to help kidney exchanges, and actually think about how you could create daisy chains to unlock the most kidneys if one person wants to donate without a specific donor in mind. So typically, if you needed a kidney and I was a close loved one of yours and I wanted to donate to you, there's actually a good chance that I won't be a match. But a little bit like blood types, there's about, I think it's 7 types of kind of kidney matches roughly that can happen. And so if there's someone else who wants to donate a kidney without someone specific in mind, they can donate to you if you're a match. And then my kidney that would have gone to you can go to someone else. because I have the comfort of knowing the person I wanted to donate a kidney to is still getting one from someone else. And so you can actually create these very long chains where one person donating without a specific person can unlock something like 25, 30 kidneys. Anyway, so this whole process is quite complicated because it's very people-oriented. And we did similar clearinghouse work where for my undergrad and then for a research degree I did afterwards, I looked at university application places. How do you think about matching people and what some of the problems were at the time with how UCAS worked? And then later on, I looked at the European asylum system. So like one problem with asylum seekers, again, don't know how interesting this is to dentists, but I find it personally very interesting, is at the time it was during the kind of Arab Spring. And so familial structures of people coming from those backgrounds was very different to the familial structures of people typically in the West. So you have nuclear families in the West where you're very close to your children and your parents, and you're maybe less close to your cousins, your uncles, your aunts. Whereas actually in a lot of the families that were having to kind of be refugees and move away, those looser family structures tended to be stronger than they would be here. And the asylum system is like super not designed to cope with that. So let's say me and my cousin apply for asylum. Our first preference is that both of us go to Germany, which was often the case at the time. But our second preference is actually one of us goes to Germany, one of us goes to Poland. The system didn't allow you to do that, and actually that then led to very weird incentives being created. And I think like the weird incentives was the bit that was always interesting to me, which is you then actually create this world where if clearinghouses are not working very well, people will end up lying about what they want to happen, because it turns out lying can be more optimal for the end outcome that you get rather than expressing your true preferences. So that was kind of originally what got me interested in like how people make these decisions, whether they're honest about what they say, what's kind of front of mind for them. And then when I was working in consulting, I think the people side was always what interested me. I did a lot of work actually in an internal team at my old company where we did pilots with teams to work out what made them effective, what made them kind of teams that had trust with each other. So the term that came up a lot was psychological safety, which essentially means the ability for an individual to feel like they can take interpersonal risk with others. And there's lots of work, and we can talk about some of the research, but basically that seems to be a extremely high driver of team performance, is the degree to which every individual in your team feels psychological safety and trust with the other members of that team. And so like part of that work actually with the pilots is we were testing different things to see what could get people to open up and be a bit more honest, what could get them to be more effective. So that was then what pushed me definitely into the much more proactive engineering a work environment role that will help people be effective rather than just kind of observing, I think, which is where I originally came from.
And hypothesizing,
and
sketching out and building decks. I mean, you also have an interesting background in that, didn't you almost become a professional poker player in between?
I took poker player very serious. I took playing poker very seriously at university. And actually, I didn't go pro, but I have a couple of friends who are professional players who play in all sorts of places. And that was something I took quite seriously. I think it's a funny domain because it's one of those things that even if you don't go pro, if you play quite seriously, it really impacts the way you think about the world. There's an amazing psychologist called Annie Duke who quit her PhD to be a professional poker player. She actually wrote 2 books about it. One of the books is called Thinking in Bets. It's excellent. And then she went back after several years of being a very high performance poker player to finish her PhD, and now she's an associate professor of psychology. And I think playing poker forces you to think very differently about risk and decisions, and it's actually quite counterintuitive at first, and you have to get quite used to the fact that your brain is bad at doing this and build strategies to get around that. So for example, like humans are pseudo-random, we don't like randomizing, and so sometimes you'll be in a situation in poker where you know the right thing to do is do something 50% of the time and do the opposite 50% of the time. So instead of trying to just guess, which we're really bad at doing, you would do funny things like look at the clock, and if the second is on an even hand, you do one thing, if the second is on an odd hand, you do another thing. And part of the reason for that, and I think this also impacts like teams more generally, is actually we have a bunch of different cognitive biases that impact the way we make decisions, and being aware of these biases is nice, but it's not good enough. The way you have to get around these biases, you have to build systems and processes in place to enable the individual to not fall prey to something that's like typically very easy to do.
Really, really interesting. So we've got your experience as an economist, into semi-professional poker playing, then into consulting, where you are consulting with big organizations about how to make them more effective and learning and gathering data and implementing change. And now we're going to extract all of that information and figure out how it applies to clinicians, because
that'd be great.
As we said, being a clinician is something that happens to you while you are at university, while you're learning healthcare skills and knowledge, and then you're flung into this world and you're expected to operate within whatever system has been put in place, and that's either a really big hospital where you're sometimes battling with processes, or it's a small local practice that's been around for ages, but also has ingrained practices.
I guess in some cases they start their own practice, right?
Or you're starting from scratch. Even more difficult. Yeah,
it was funny. I listened to the episode you did with Dan from Hive, and it was amazing the parallels I heard between some of the people who are starting their own businesses as clinicians and in their practices with like the founders I work with, especially in kind of small growing tech companies. It's like very similar problems they're facing in kind of day-to-day delivery.
Really interesting. It's starting a tech company, why would it be that different to starting a brand new dental clinic on the high street?
And almost always
hiring challenges, goal setting, really similar.
Totally agree. And almost always you start with one thing in mind, which is like, I have a good idea, or I am good at doing this particular role, and then you kind of accidentally find yourself running a business. That's how like a lot of the founders I speak to end up finding their way there. And I guess as a clinician, if you're looking for progression, there aren't that many options other than you can either move practice or you can start your own. And I don't know, it's one of those funny things where actually if you look at entrepreneurs and people who start businesses, it's actually quite helpful to be a bit naive and optimistic, because the reality is that going in with a mindset of, I really want to do this and I think I will be able to do this, enables you to kind of get through some of the inevitable difficulty. Because I think whenever you pursue anything meaningful, it's almost always difficult, and difficult things are frustrating, and trying to think about how you have the resilience to get through those moments, I think is a really interesting domain. There's like lots of quite interesting research that looks at it. Okay,
so let's jump into some of the practical aspects, or things that we can start to take away for the listeners when they think about going into work the very next Monday, or whenever it might be. So how do you think about, or what does the evidence show about being happy or fulfilled in work or in your career?
Motivation is one of those things that people have studied for a really long time, especially since the kind of 70s and 80s where the original work came out. The best model for like what drives happiness and drive is by two psychologists who I love, called Deci and Ryan. It's called self-determination theory, and it basically has three components to what drive motivation. So the first is autonomy, which is how much control do you have over your day-to-day life, your day-to-day work, and how much control does, for example, your job give you outside of work. So that's where things like pay come in. Like pay gives you a bit of control outside of your work life, but also things like boundaries and time, and so those all kind of contribute to a sense of autonomy. The second is mastery, which is this idea that I get better at the thing I do, whether that's I become more technically proficient, whether that's I'm learning more skills, whether that's because I get to do a totally different domain that I never thought I'd be able to do. So that gives lots of meaning and motivation to people. And then the third thing is relatedness, which actually has kind of two components to it. I think the first is about the people you work with and the patients you talk to. It's like, how much do you feel like you're contributing and you can relate to the impacts they see? And then the second thing, which I think is in particular relevant to people in dentistry and in a medical domain more generally, is the idea of like your job being meaningful and you relating to the meaning that you contribute to society through your job. So like relatedness has the kind of very concrete, I can see the people I'm helping, and the more abstract, but I think equally important, like I feel like my job is having a positive impact. So autonomy, meaning, autonomy, mastery, and relatedness are like the three that seem to drive. well-being.
I think this speaks to a lot of certainly what we try and do at 32Co, which is to try and empower clinicians to learn new things, to give them more independence in their clinical practice and make them feel like they're getting better every day at their job. It is something we really do obsess about. And I think when you then describe the flip side of that, so what does it feel or look like in a job where you don't have those things?
Yeah, so I think for each of them, it can be extremely difficult. So I think maybe let's start at the third one and go backwards. So I think relatedness, if you feel like you don't have meaning in the kind of work you do, you don't feel like your job has a particular purpose, it's very hard to motivate yourself to do anything. Like, so Angela Duckworth, who's a psychologist, writes a lot about grit. And for her, grit comes down to two things, which is passion and perseverance. And to be passionate about something, you have to feel like the work you're doing is meaningful. And it only then does perseverance matter. Like, you can only persevere if you really care about something. So that element of relatedness is really important. And if you don't have that, it's very difficult to find the drive to do it. And I think there's, again, more research that looks at whether people are kind of internally or externally or intrinsically and extrinsically motivated. But purpose is like a big part of that. The second kind of element of relatedness is actually if you don't feel connected to those that you work with, it can be quite lonely. And actually, like currently my business is just me, and so it's actually quite important to me that when I talk to clients, I have an element of that where I feel personal connection to the people that I'm talking to. And I think you can quite easily find yourself in a place where you sleepwalk into loneliness, and I think loneliness is one of those things that is an absolute epidemic. We can talk about it a bit more if you want, but so for example, the US Surgeon General formally announced in the US that it was an epidemic last year, and if you look at the rates of loneliness, it's something like 50% of the UK population is sometimes, often, or always lonely. And that has huge impacts on your health, it has huge impacts on your emotional resilience, it has impacts on whether you feel like you're motivated at work, and a whole bunch of different things. Which, yeah, like I said, we can go into. But the second element of that is the mastery element, is what we spoke about. And I think I really strongly believe that learning is a key driver of happiness, because I think there's something that is important about learning marking the progression of time. And I think this is an area which is like not so well researched. I would eventually love to do some of my own research in this, but I think being able to look at where you are now and where you were 6 months ago and be able to concretely point to a few things you knew now that you would not have known back then, or things that you can do now that you couldn't have done back then, is like one of the key ways you can feel gratitude. It's one of the key ways that you can feel like you see progress. And so I think mastery is a key element of that process of kind of giving your life direction and meaning, and giving that feeling that you're kind of going on an upwards trajectory. So I think that's really important. And then autonomy, I think, is one of those things where actually it's spoken about a lot in companies, and especially in large companies. So in the 80s, there was this kind of stereotype of very hierarchical organizations with lots and lots of different layers. And there was this general feeling that there was almost no autonomy. You had no control over what you were doing. You had a manager who told you what to do. And if you look at the productivity data, people were just like really unproductive, and they weren't particularly happy, and it wasn't a good way to live. And then from the early 90s till today, there's been what economists and psychologists kind of call the great flattening, which is where these organizations get flatter and flatter and flatter. And that was initially very positive, actually. So from the 80s to about the early 2000s, you could see decision-making was getting more decentralized. It meant that teams were more autonomous. But actually, the data then shows, weirdly, from kind of the early 2000s till now, a lot of the flattening has actually contributed to more centralized decision-making in organizations, which is quite interesting. And it actually shows that maybe there's been a bit of a reversal to this trend of giving people more autonomy. And like, you can totally understand why, because if you own a business, or you run a business, or you are a technical expert and you're working with people who you maybe feel are less technical than you, it's very scary to give up a degree of control over things you maybe feel like you have more expertise in or more experience in. And and ultimately that's quite a vulnerable process. It's one of those things where you have to go through that exercise to prove to yourself that the outcomes can be good. And I think one of the things that's really important is trying to experiment with this domain of like small areas of delegation and autonomy and seeing how it turns out. Because I think there's a lot of quite interesting psychology evidence on like negativity bias. And basically this idea is that you assume worse things will happen than actually happen, or you think of all the negative hypotheticals and you don't really put very much weight on the positive hypotheticals. So one example for this is when you give feedback to people, people worry that if you're very honest with them, that they'll take it terribly. And so then you water down your feedback. And famously, there's this approach of having a good bit of feedback, then a nasty bit of feedback, and then a good bit of feedback. And I think the framing of nasty is something we should think about. But I think that sandwiching actually is terrible because people's memories are not objective. They tend to remember the first thing and the last thing they hear, which means they hear the two fuzzy bits of feedback that don't matter, and they don't hear the direct, meaningful thing you're trying to tell them in the middle. And we spoke about psychological safety earlier. Part of building psychological safety is intellectual and emotional honesty. And anyway, I think all of these things relate to the fact that autonomy of the three is the hardest to achieve. And it's a balancing act between how much control you want to give up and you're comfortable giving up with the level of responsibility people are willing to take on in your firm. And I think it's definitely the area where people should be careful about doing kind of deliberate experiments to try and learn what's best for them. Okay,
so you said a ton there that I want to dive into that I think is really, really practically applicable. So I think the first thing to dive into is mastery, and the idea that as a clinician, when you're a smart person who goes to university, you get spat out the other end, then you're into the real world, and then it's up to you to continue your learning. And I think most clinicians, especially in dentistry, do take time to go on courses and things like that. Sure. But I think what we also hear a lot is that sometimes just the course itself feels like it's the work done.
Yeah.
Because, well, you paid some money and you attended, and surely, I've ticked the box, right? So how might we think about mastery more holistically when it comes to feeling fulfilled in your career as a clinician?
So there's actually some really great research specifically on mastery, because it's an approach that's increasingly being used in schools actually and universities, which is this idea that actually mastery isn't just about learning stuff. Learning stuff is an element of it, but it's really about taking a big goal or objective, and those tend to be behaviors you can't do or struggle to do today, or skills you don't know, technical skills you don't know how to do, and breaking big things into smaller chunks, and each of those incremental chunks not progressing through that stage until you've completed the stage before. So something like going on a course is a required early stage towards a process of mastery, but it's not sufficient. And actually, if you think about the kind of skills that people want to learn in the courses that Deci does, they're quite technical, hands-on, practical skills that they're applying. They're not just bits of knowledge that they have to remember. And so there's actually a structure in like learning design and instructional design, which is called Bloom's hierarchy of learning. And at the bottom of the hierarchy of learning is just recall. I can remember a fact that I can tell you tomorrow. And at the top of the hierarchy of learning is the really difficult, like practical stuff, which is I can create a plan, or I can physically do a skill. And the higher you want to go up the hierarchy of learning, the more it starts to become important that the learning goes outside of just, for example, a classroom setting, and you take that learning and you apply it in practice, and you reflect on how it's gone and think about what you would do differently next time. Or spaced learning is really important, this idea that you should for sure do a big bout of learning at the start, but that you should do some sense of refreshing that learning as you go on. There's a really excellent course called Learning How to Learn, which is on Coursera. It's totally free. It's by Dr. Barbara Oakley, who's a neuroscientist. It goes through all the science of like literally what is happening in your neurons when you're learning a new skill. Why does it take time? Because it turns out like parts of your brain are physiologically changing. That's quite hard. What's the neurochemical process? And then what are some ways that you can actually like deliberately practice that. And so one of the techniques she talks about is something called the Pomodoro method, which is where you have bouts of focus followed by breaks and then followed by other bouts of focus, so that you can space the work that you're doing, but also so that you can retain motivation to do the actual practical work that often requires follow-up from, for example, like a classroom learning exercise.
So there's a lot more that goes into it, and it's very conscious. And I think you're right. We do spend a lot of time on learning design in the courses, and it's not just a case of learn this stuff and then go away. There's a guided process throughout the weeks, and it's deliberately spaced out to make sure that you have time to assimilate and then to move on, like you say, to the next thing, and also to apply it practically. So, for example, for us, it's very important that if you're going to be going on a course, that you actually have a patient who you can apply the learnings to 100%. And with, even if they never go ahead with treatment. It's more about giving yourself the confidence that you've translated what you've read into practice.
So that's something called contextual learning, which is the more you can anchor the learning you do to a very specific real thing in your life, the more A, you're going to remember it, and B, the more likely it is that knowledge will kind of actually impact your behavior. So that's really crucial. It's really important to how people learn.
Okay, so having covered learning and let's say you've got that shored up, that's only one part of the three pillars that you mentioned, and autonomy being the more difficult one. But why don't we talk a bit about relatedness? Sure. Because in clinical practice, you've got your patient, and you've also got the team that's around you. So you kind of have lots of different stakeholders that you need to be thinking about.
Yeah.
So why don't we start with actually the team that's around you, and how might you think about designing a great environment for people to work in as clinicians?
So I think there's lots and lots of components to what makes teams great. Google did a massive set of randomized control trials across teams where they tried to look at performance. And the thing we spoke about earlier, which was psychological safety, came out as one of the primary things that drove how much teams worked well together. And part of the reason for that was actually because teams need to trust each other in order to be really direct in their communication. For someone to say to someone more senior than them, I don't think this thing you're doing is working, or I think we should experiment with this totally new thing, that requires you to be quite direct, and it requires you to feel like there's not going to be like personal consequences. And so there's quite a few concrete things that teams can do to boost the psychological safety of how they operate in businesses. I think one is create space for those direct conversations. One thing that I really, really recommend most companies do is that they create a moment. Typically it's once a month, but it can be longer, maybe once every few months, every 3 months, where they, as a group, sit in a room and reflect on what went really well, what didn't go well, and what should they think about doing differently next time. In technology companies, they refer to these as retrospectives. I think they're just an important moment of collective reflection. Part of that that's also important is creating a culture of gratitude. So one thing that's really funny is when you talk to managers and you ask them how grateful are they for the work that's done by the people in their organizations, they almost always say they're super grateful. And then you survey the same people who work in their companies, and the perceived gratefulness is like totally misaligned. They think that their leadership aren't grateful, and there's this kind of skewed perception. Part of the reason for that is that lots of people aren't very explicit with recognizing progress and appreciating. So one practice that one of the CEOs I work with now does is sends thank you notes once every 2 weeks. Like he has a time slot once every 2 weeks, which is blocked off, which is I think in a Friday morning, where he sits down at his laptop. He basically turns off Slack, or turns off all the communications, turns off email, all of it, and in a Word document writes the 5 to 6 people who he saw do things that made him feel grateful or appreciated in the last 2 weeks. And then he sends them that message. And if he can, he sends it in person in like a written like piece of paper, which is like very clear. He spent time to think about it. It's something that it's almost always a very specific example. The more specific it is, the more meaningful it is for the person who receives it. And that kind of recognition is a massively easy way to boost the amount of trust that you have in your teams. So I think that's one component of the relatedness. There's like lots more that we can talk about, but I think it's funny how much directness can also come from things like role clarity, like explaining to people, like, this is the scope of what your job is and what the expectations are. If you want to do things that are outside of that, that's okay. We can actually have a conversation about whether that should also be part of your job or not. But it gives people a bit more comfort to be like, oh, actually, this is within my domain. This is something I feel able to actually change. I'm going to suggest the change. So that's another technique. Another technique is to really think about like the why. I think the rationale of why people do the work they do is really underspoken about, or if it's spoken about, it's often spoken about in quite generic terms. Like, we're trying to help people. It's like, that's great, but like, what are you actually trying to do? Like, what are the concrete things you're trying to do? And this actually relates to a whole bunch of domains. I think if people feel like they understand the rationale and they think something is fair, they're much more likely to engage wholeheartedly in whatever the process is. We can talk about some funny psychology experiments with Xerox printers if you want, but
let's go on to those, because I think those little stories, I think, do stick in people's mind. But I think bringing it back to the sort of practical reality of running, let's say, a practice.
Sure.
I think what you're saying is, getting people into a room and creating an environment where they don't feel like they're going to be shouted at or shot down if they come up with a suggestion, no matter how senior or junior they are, is a really important step. The second thing that people can do in a practice is, if you're in a leadership position, and that might not be from a hierarchical perspective, it might also be from a sort of perceived senior role where everybody recognises that you perhaps are the most experienced.
Or a thought leader.
Or a thought leader, taking the time to thank or to express recognition of the hard work of others.
And the flip side is also true, which is that as a leader, if you are willing to admit mistakes or errors you've made, it creates an environment where others are much more willing to do that as well. And so the tip I normally give kind of leaders is, if you are in a meeting, if they're sharing reflections about what happened, you talk last. And if you're sharing mistakes you've made or things that you think you might have gotten wrong, you talk first. And that both of those set the environment and the tone for the wider organization. I think like one of the phrases that someone I used to work with that really stuck with me is like, leaders cast long shadows. And like, leadership isn't just about, like you said, hierarchical roles. If you feel like you have a intellectual or a thought leadership position or an emotional leadership position, then you have an ability to influence the environment that other people are interacting with.
So telling people that you made a mistake doesn't make you a weak leader?
No, it makes you a much stronger leader, and it's super scary. So you have to like test it for yourself and get used to it. But the thing that's interesting is people trust those who are willing to admit when they're wrong more, because people make mistakes all the time. But it's very hard to learn from mistakes if no one talks about them. And I think for me, there's also domains where it's more tolerable to make errors and less tolerable to make errors. And so I think, like in a clinical setting, you can't make mistakes. And so what that really means, or if you do make mistakes, you have to like go through very rigorous compliance processes to make sure that they're followed up correctly. And so the time you spend in that clinical zone is what I would classify as kind of performance zone time. You really have to be like on your ball, on your game, like really thinking about all the different steps going on. And so what that means is, to get into that mind space, you have to spend a lot of the rest of your time not in performance zone. You have to spend the rest of your time in learning zone, time where it's more tolerable to think through what might have gone wrong, what might be different, because it enables you to perform in that clinical setting where like the cost of errors is much higher and the cost of getting something wrong is much higher for your patients. And so I think it's about thinking about when, because the best example of this that I love is the example of people who act on stage in theatres, which is they spend like 6 to 12 months rehearsing for a play that they might perform for 5 nights. And the 6 to 12 months of time is learning zone time. And then the 5 nights of performance are performance zone time. And when you're on game face, game day, like you have to be at a very high level. One of the things that helps you most getting to that high level is having spent loads of time thinking about your job and your role before you even get there. Like, I think something with the courses, for example, is actually like, it's so much better to, over a space of time, think about a very technical thing you're doing, so that when you go into that technical experience, you're thinking way less about it. You don't have to think about, am I doing this step right or this step right? Because you kind of know that already. And all your mental bandwidth and all your focus can really be put on performing at a high level clinically.
But how do you do that? So I'm really busy in clinic. You know,
Yeah.
I work 5 days a week. Like you say, I'm performing and I don't want to drop the ball because you never know when the next complaint's going to come in. And it's very stressful when your patients are unhappy. So how do I make the learning phase not feel like work in addition?
Yeah. So I think there's a few things you can do. The first is that I think just acknowledge. There's like a lot of evidence that the more you even just tell yourself like learning time is valuable, the more likely you are to prioritize it. So I think the fact that people are listening to this podcast hopefully already contributes to that understanding. So that's one thing. I think the second thing is to craft explicit time for it and think of that time as an investment in your future performance, and think about it a little bit like how an athlete trains. Like, you need to be deliberate about time where you are rehearsing and practicing skills that you then need to perform at a high level, because that's what it takes to perform at a high level. I think that's the reality. And I think also constantly striving to improve helps you feel motivated to perform well. So I think we spoke about motivation earlier, but actually there's this feeling that you're progressing actually is a factor that allows you to get more into the zone more often. And I think the stress piece is really interesting. So there's a lot of work by Alia Crum, who's a psychologist in Stanford, which looks at what's called a stress enhances performance mindset, which is basically, if you imagine stress is just a physiological reaction to you feeling like you have high stakes. It's basically a fight or flight response, and it's mobilizing resources in your body to do things to respond in that kind of setting, right? So we don't live in a hunter-gatherer society anymore, but when you are worried, your heart rate goes up because it's getting ready for you to like run or fight, and your brain and your body is getting more oxygen. And so thinking about how you can leverage stress is actually a really interesting domain. So there's basically two worlds. There's a world which is called distress, which is a term everyone's familiar with, but basically in psychology, distress just means the physiological effects of stress are detrimental to your performance. And for sure, if you are feeling acute, very extreme stress, or you're feeling very chronic stress, it tends to be distress. There's also something called eustress, which is something that people don't tend to talk about, which is actually how can you use stress to enhance your performance. And a stress enhances performance mindset basically is the science of how you can think about adopting mindsets and physiological changes to enhance performance in stressful times. And there's basically three things. It's like a 3-step process. The first thing is to recognize you're stressed. And I think that's something that actually does take a bit of practice to get used to, like what physiological things tend to be associated with your version of stress, like what mindset, what environments tend to trigger the levels of stress. So the first thing is like realize I'm feeling a bit stressed. The second thing is identifying why you're stressed. And the funny thing about stress is you are almost always stressed because you really care about something. So I'm stressed with a patient because I really care about that patient's outcomes. And just acknowledging the underlying thing you care about that is triggering the stress, it turns out is massively performance enhancing. And then the third thing is to actually think about how can this stress be useful to me? Because like we said, the stress is a physiological response that's designed to be helpful. Like often it's not proportionate, and that's something that you should think about in the different settings, but it's something that's designed to like help you. And if you look at Navy SEALs and you look at athletes, there's lots of evidence that the people who perform really well are the ones who can work out how to best get bang for buck, basically. If you're going to be stressed anyway, how can you make the most of it? And so one thing I always love as an example of this is when you are stressed, you feel urgency. When you feel like things are urgent, you're going to try a whole bunch of things that might be ideas you would never have come up with otherwise. And so stress actually is a unlock for creativity. That's an interesting positive. Another interesting positive is like when you're stressed, you tend to work faster. And that can be really effective. It means you can respond quickly to when things are going wrong. You tend to be more attentive to the specific thing you're focusing on. So actually think about what what specific areas are best to focus on and spend that attention on. Because one of the things that's funny is when you're physically stressed, like your field of vision like literally narrows. And what that means is the amount of attention on that field is way higher. That can be great for your performance. And so I think the 3 steps are recognize you're stressed, like work out why, and work out what is the thing you care about that's triggering that. And then third is how can you make that helpful? And that's a great way of converting distress to eustress in like a lot of different scenarios.
Super helpful. Really, really interesting. And I think I want to, again, tie it back to something that makes this practical around, I mean, obviously there's the piece that I want to do the best for my patient, and I want my very busy days to feel productive and not just like I'm under... I've got the weight of the world on my shoulders. Yeah. One thing that you did mention that I think will help is to think about how goals come into this.
Yeah.
You know, again, when you're practicing as a clinician, there are lots of different people with actually different goals. And I think there are 2 things that are potentially problematic is that you don't know what your own goals are. You haven't explicitly set them for yourself, and that nobody else knows what they are, so they can't help you. So how do we think about that?
Yeah, so I think focus is one of the resources that is in shortest supply amongst people who are leading businesses, and is probably the single most effective thing you can do to boost performance outside of kind of environmental factors like we were talking about psychological safety. The single best process thing you can do is encourage people to be more focused with their time. The reality is we are really bad at prioritizing. Like, there's a whole bunch of different reasons why. We're also really bad at working out once we've decided to do something, whether it's worth continuing pursuing that thing. And so like having a effective, I think, as you described it, a goal setting process or a prioritization process is really important, because it sets in stone before you do the task, what are the things that are really important? What are some ways you can measure success? And those are less subject to like cognitive biases when you're in the process of delivering. So there's this funny bias, which is like if you're doing something difficult and it goes well, you attribute all of the success to yourself. And when things go badly, you attribute all of the failure to external factors. The reality is in both of those situations, it's probably a mix of both of those things. So one thing that I like to do when I encourage people to goal set is to do things like set success and kill criteria, which is, okay, for the next quarter, I'm going to pilot something. Like, okay, let's say for 30 Kiko, right, you're going to pilot trying out clear aligners with your patients. What does success look like? It probably looks like you've tried it with a minimum number of patients, you've solicited feedback from them, and you've received positive feedback, and you think you're getting good dental outcomes, like health outcomes for them. So those are great success criteria. The more objectively you can measure them, the better. So instead of saying talk to some patients, talk to 3 patients, like pick a number. And then a month, 2 months, 3 months from now, whenever you set your review, you should be able to look back at those goals and say, actually, have I ticked or not ticked these things? And then once you've done that, then you can think about why. And I think that tends to be less subject to these biases. And that's, I think, one element of goal setting that's really important. I think the second thing about goal setting that's really important is doing lots of things is not costless. So task switching is actually a big loss economically and psychologically for basically any business owner, which is that the more you keep swapping between tasks, A, the worse you perform in those tasks, and B, the kind of the less you will be able to identify the importance of what really matters. Like, the reality is most people could do 30% fewer things and take the things they're doing and do them better. And so that focus is really hard, and you have to be really deliberate about thinking about what are some of the things you want to do. I think we spoke about, organizational learning earlier, but one thing that I think is really important is being able to say, what are things you want to be able to answer in 3 months' time? Like the clear aligner example is, do I want to expand the number of people who I'm doing clear aligners with in 3 months' time? And then you can use that question, that hypothesis, to then build what are the most important aspects of that you need to focus on. So I think if you don't do that, you tend to be quite fragmented. Fragmentation has a cost at several levels. There's the task switching cost, which is when you actually move from one task to another task. It takes you a while to catch up, your brain to catch up with the fact that you're doing something different. And so the first chunk of time you do that other task for, you perform badly. That's just the reality. Or you don't perform your best. You don't have like full cognitive resources to be able to do that. There's another cost, which is actually that your mental bandwidth is also more fragmented, which is this idea that like we have a certain amount of space mentally. It's actually not strictly exactly like this, but this is a pretty good analogy, right? We have a certain amount of space of things we can think about, and the more things you have to think about at the same time, the less bandwidth you can allocate to each thing. And what it means is you get less done. Like if you're trying to do 3 things, it's 33% of your mental bandwidth. You're much more likely to solve all 3 of those things than if you're trying to do 50 things and each one has 2% of your mental bandwidth. And we're not very good mentally at like cleverly allocating bandwidth. So the step in the process you can use to fix that is at the goal setting step. It's not at the think differently step. That's like very hard to do.
Yeah, it makes sense.
So that's why I think goals are really important. Yeah.
So setting yourself a really clear goal that you can focus, not 15 goals, one clear goal that's really measurable, that you can get excited about, that you can look at every day and go, am I getting closer to that? So that then we can hit what you said right at the beginning of mastery. Like I can look back 6 months later and be like, I actually did that.
Yeah, and it also gives people that sense of autonomy, which is actually the more clear you are on what the bounds are of what they need to do, the more they feel like they can deliver within those bounds. So there's some really funny research, but basically like there's a paper, I think it's called Coloring Within the Lines, which is this idea that actually the more constraints you add, the more people feel enabled to have freedom within those constraints. And so actually one of the things you can do to make people really creative in lots of different domains is to add constraints, which sounds super weird, but like it turns out if you give people fewer degrees of freedom, they use the degrees of freedom they have more. And that's equally true of goal setting.
Yeah. Okay, so an example might be, I really want to get, my first 10 patients in the next 6 months to do this treatment for the first time, but I'm only allowed to do it on a Thursday. How am I going to get these patients in specifically on a Thursday?
Right? Yeah.
But make you think really creatively about, well, what kind of patients, should I be speaking to, and how can I block my
diary?
What
are they doing on a Thursday?
What's special about Thursday? Yeah. And then once I've set my goals, because I think that's really powerful and it is really actionable as well, and I don't think it's something that clinicians generally do for themselves.
Yeah.
Who should I tell? Should I write it down in a book? Should I put it in my diary? What should I put it?
It's a good question. I think you should tell for sure everyone you work in your organization with. I actually also recommend, it's scary, but I think the reality is like we said earlier, intellectual vulnerability is a key way you build trust. It's also where you get alignment. So I think there's like a phrase my partner uses, which is unsaid expectations are unfair expectations. As a leader, you have a whole bunch of things that are in your head that are how you feel like the organization should operate. The reality is that a lot of those expectations are actually not obvious to the people you're working with, even if you think about them every single day. And so trying to understand what level of detail, I think, is a good question. But like at least at the highest level of detail, basically everyone in your company should know, like in the next 6 months, we're trying to do these two or three things. Then when you get to really operational stuff, then you should for sure restrict the group of people who need to know all the details about different things. It's like not interesting to some people if it's very unrelated to their job. But like at the highest level, that's actually key to driving some of the motivation elements we spoke about. The second thing is it sounds really old fashioned. I love like writing a letter, which is like at the end of every goal setting period, you say, okay, 6 months ago, we set these 3 goals. And here's the progress we made because we set some success criteria or kill criteria. Kill criteria is just the reverse, by the way, of success criteria, which are what are some things that if we see, we should probably pull the plug on an idea. So here are objectively how we've done versus what we thought we would do. Because ultimately, all goals are really just hypotheses about the world in the next X months. So you write how the world actually turned out. And the second thing you write is, okay, there's a difference between what we thought would happen and what actually happened. That's good data. Like, what have we learned from that we genuinely didn't know a few months ago? And that can be like really obvious things like, did you speak to a different type of customer? And what did you learn from that? Or did you try something and it didn't work? And what did you learn from that? So that's a really crucial thing. And then the third thing you do is you write what the next set of goals are, which should be informed by those previous 2 areas you've written. And I think the act of physically writing it down or like typing it in like a long form memo kind of format, I think is very good at crystallizing the thinking process. And if you want a small tip, my recommendation is when you write one of these things, either don't bring your laptop and do it on a piece of paper, or if you are bringing your laptop and you're typing it out, turn off your internet, because it's amazing how much it's actually like mentally quite difficult to do this, and how much like small distractions will totally shift your attention away from this. And 3 months later, you'll realize, oh, I didn't write last quarter's letter. I should probably think about next quarter's letter. And it's one of those processes where, like all good habits, the more you do it regularly, the easier it gets to do.
And it's really scary and feels odd when you do it the first time.
And you know what? The first time you do it, don't send it to anyone.
Yeah.
Just write it for yourself.
What if you don't hit it? You know, you're going to feel
it's okay.
stupid.
Yeah.
I think one of the areas where people might struggle is, well, I'm going to set myself some goals. I feel pretty vulnerable about that because I don't actually know whether I'm going to hit them. And now I'm going to have to go and tell my boss. I mean, you know, the example might be, look, I really do want to do, you know, this sort of treatment for the first time, and I would like to set myself a goal of 10, but shall I go and tell my practice owner that?
So I think the reality is, if you don't feel comfortable doing that, you're better off doing a private version of it for yourself than not doing one at all. So like, I think if you think of like, I think the incremental version of this is just do it privately for yourself. And I think that is actually, that gets you some of the benefit. There's a lot of evidence that actually if you share things like goals, you're more accountable for those goals. So actually the process of sharing it, whilst it's uncomfortable, two things are true. The more you do it, the less uncomfortable it gets. And secondly, the more you share it with other people, the more you feel like you actually have to deliver those things. And that actually ends up helping you make the time later to actually do those things. Like, let's say you've decided you want to do something more technical in the next 3 months. It's always hard to find time to do that. But if you've promised someone you really respect that you're going to do it, you're much more likely to make the time than otherwise. And so I think I totally understand that it's a scary thing to do. Try with a small goal, like try and incrementally prove to yourself it's actually okay to talk about this with people. And I think the more you get used to that vulnerability, the more it also role models it for other people in your organization. That's really important.
For sure. And I think when you're setting those goals for yourself, I think that the final thing I would add to that is that you'll probably be amazed by the reception from good leaders in how much they actually want to help you get there.
100%, yeah.
So although it might sound scary, you'll probably find people falling over themselves to try and, because for the first time you've said, look, actually would love some help with this.
And it's almost always something that they would have previously struggled with. And that can be a really great way of building a relationship with them. And we spoke about relatedness, but actually shared experiences are one of the best ways of building connection with others. And actually, like, even with leaders, I think people love to play mentor roles. People love to be supporting in the development of someone else. And so actually, like, opening up can end up being quite an effective way to build a better relationship with someone who might be more senior than you, for example.
And also, I think there are sometimes people who perhaps are considered less senior get left out of this, but, you know, choosing who to share your goals with and only picking the sort of really, really important people, I think potentially misses out on a lot of the benefits as well. So saying, for example, I've got a big revenue target as a practice owner, and that's quite sort of, it's scary, but it's also maybe, you don't feel that comfortable sharing it, so you only tell one or two of your dentists. But what about the reception team who can actually 100%. Really help you with that?
The people on the ground who are doing a lot of the work.
On the ground. I mean, maybe trusting them with that information will actually help them understand what you want from them.
Yeah. And what an empowering way to help them know what questions to ask patients who are coming in. And I think the more you can make it clear that they're part of a collective mission, like there's lots of funny studies of things like when the space race was happening, like people felt unified under a set of goals, and that was a huge driver for collaboration, effective cross-disciplinary working, and can actually lead to people all across the organization for sure feel that kind of alignment. So yeah, I totally agree.
Isar, we've covered so much here. I think there are so many practical tips here. I think maybe want to leave the listener with, if I have to do something tomorrow, if I could do one thing tomorrow, what shall I do to take me on this journey to have a better, a more fulfilled career using psychological tools to help me get there?
It's a good question. I think making time to read about an element you want to learn is the best. Like, learning something is a momentum-driven activity, and the more you're learning, the more easy it is to then continue learning, and the more you see value in it. So I know one area that we maybe wanted to talk about, but I think we've run out of time, is on habit formation, and how do you think about like nudging the behavior of your patients to, for example, comply with guidance more. Like, there's some great resources out there, and just diving into a book like, I don't know, like Atomic Habits, which is like not particularly like technical, but actually has a really great explanation of how habits form, can make you think about a slight change in how you interact with your patients, and then that you'll hopefully see positive outcomes, and then that will then lead to you experimenting with a different field. And if people want, I can give a full reading list of like maybe 5 or 6 books that I think are just great and cover like learning elements we've spoken about. But I think basically pick a thing and try and learn it as quickly as you can. The hope is then you'll see the progress there, you'll feel like it's more meaningful, and then you'll continue kind of pushing to learn. So I think for me, the learning element is the easiest, most actionable thing to take away.
Great advice. Okay. Thank you, Isar, for all of your fantastic insight and wisdom. You are extraordinarily well read in this topic, and you have a ton of experience also helping companies of all sizes in all sectors. So if people want to find out more about Uncover, where should they go?
So I have a website, which is www.uncover.business. That's where you can read about the kind of work I do with companies, and you can read about the type of techniques we use, for example, to get people to be really honest, that we spoke about earlier. I also write a lot about psychology, so I have a newsletter, so that you can find that at uncover.substack.com. I think both of those links will be in the show notes. And that covers a whole range of topics, from, like, we spoke about individual resilience, we spoke about loneliness, but it also covers kind of more organizational topics. Like recently I wrote about trends in managers and what the evidence is about what makes someone a really great manager. And so, yeah, you can read some of the writing that I do there. And
amazing. All really applicable, especially to small practices where not as much attention is perhaps given to this when you compare it to sort of big corporations. Sure,
and I'd say one parting thought is, if you're in a small practice, you have more control in changing how the practice runs.
Very good point.
And you have more autonomy, which is great. And like trying to think about how you can leverage that is really important.
That is such a good point. The power is in your hands. You can make change. It's not like an oil tanker that's going to take you forever to shift. So really, really helpful. Isar, thoroughly enjoyed chatting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been fun.
That's it for another episode of Modern Dentist, and we look forward to seeing you next time.